Okay, so we should be live. I'm really excited today to have Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed with me. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm glad that we're finally able to have it. So, Khushamadid people, as Ishtiaq Ahmed Saab likes to call on his channel. Without further ado, I would add Ishtiaq Saab to the call.
Hello, Ji.
How are you doing, Dr. Ahmed?
Very well, thank you.
I'm
How are
sorry
you
for
doing?
I'm good. I'm sorry for the little mishap that we
No,
had in joining this call, but yeah,
no problem.
yeah. How have you been keeping up though? Because I really watch a lot of your content on your YouTube channel, but I also I'm a big fan of your book. I'm currently making my way through your Punjab book. So
Uh-huh.
could you sort of talk a little bit about this whole process of taking to videos online and also adding it as another venture of your creative process?
Well, actually, some friends told me that reading books and spending time in understanding the whole content of a book is becoming increasingly less attractive to many people. They just want the gist of things. So why don't you start doing videos on your research? I was a bit hesitant because you have to oversimplify in a video, and sometimes the complications which are there in the book in terms of research cannot be made explicit. But then I decided that this is one way that you connect with lots of people, including, for example, you. So so the videos have come to stay with me, but I continue doing my research as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this your background and how you got into the research that you are doing as like a political scientist, but also primarily looking at what your research interests are, like South Asia, human rights, and those sorts of things?
Well, how did I get into doing this research? You want to know?
Yeah, I mean, what was?
I'm born on the 24th of February 1947
Oh
in
wow.
Lahore on Temple Road, where two horrific incidents took place. And my mother was witness to one of them. This was on the 12th of August 1947, when she was just looking out from our window, which opens on Temple Road, and she saw that on her right hand, the local hooligans, Gunda type, had assembled. At that time, Lahore was on fire, stabbings, killings were taking place all over. So she could sense that there was some problem on the way with this sort of crowd, assembled in the square. And then she looked on her left and she saw uh, a Sikh coming on a motorbike. He was a big man, and these gundas tried to attack him. He took out a gun and they dispersed. In Punjabi, we say they titter bitter ho gaye. You know,
Yeah.
most of such people are basically cowards. Bullies are normally cowards, so they dispersed. Then, about 20 minutes later, an old Sikh carpenter came on his bike, and on the handle of his bike was the daily potli. Potli is a piece of cloth in which you have the meal for the day, and he was going to his work wherever. Common people didn't understand that the partition is taking place and you are no longer wanted here and you must leave or whatever. So these people killed this man in a merciless manner. He kept on pleading for mercy, but nobody paid any heed. And that traumatized my mother. And so I grew up listening to this story, and then this was confirmed from people who had shops and so on Temple Road, who continued to talk about this story. So I grew up wondering why the partition, who were these people who lived here once and we never see them again, Hindus and Sikhs. Very close to our house is a, a Sikh temple called Chemi Badshai, uh, apparently established by one of the gurus but rebuilt in 1930s, where a planned attack was uh, undertaken with the connivance of the police by the local gundas on Sikhs who had come from northern Punjab waiting for a chance to cross the border into India. Okay, so that's another incident from just 200 meters from where our house is. Both these stories were always being told and retold and discussed. So that's one reason. And I wondered what was the partition all about. Then, when I was at uh, Stockholm University teaching and all, the Yugoslav civil war came about. And once again, it was a repeat of ethnic killing, genocide, ethnic cleansing taking place. So I thought I had to uh, uh, dig into the past of this, you know, huge tragedy which transpired in the Punjab. And I found there was very little literature that you could refer to, scholarly literature. Of course, there was fictional literature in abundance. Manto, Krishan Chandar, Bedi, Khushwant Singh, you name the writer, Punjabis and non Punjabis, all of them wrote their best stories on the partition. But insofar as scholarly research is concerned, very scant material. Mostly it was the reports left behind by the governors and chief secretaries of Punjab. And historians are used to looking at archival material, so they would stop on the 14th of August. But the real killing started on the 15th and then continued till the end of the year. About 10,000 people were killed by August 14, 1947. At the end of the day, anywhere between 800,000 to 1 million Punjabis had been killed, and 10 million had run for their lives to cross the border, depending on whether they were Hindus, Sikhs, or they were Muslims. So that's where I thought that I had to do something to bring about uh, the oral histories or eyewitness accounts of the partition of Punjab. Of course, in India, some work had been done, very limited, but still very relevant. And that was in 1997 on the 50th anniversary of the partition. And Urvashi Batalia did a book. Then Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin did another book. These were Indian feminists who talked to some women from northern Punjab around Rawalpindi who were now living in Delhi and around Delhi and told their story. But I had the ambition of doing it for the whole of Punjab. So then I applied for a grant to the Swedish academy, which they very generously gave me. Then I had 3 full years of visiting Indian Punjab and then Pakistani Punjab, and after that that grant finished, I was still not done with the story. So I kept on working on it from my own sort of salary and so on. So altogether, about 12 years in doing that book. I collected about 400 eyewitness accounts, of which about 260 or so are in the book, because some were only repetition of the same, you know. So that's the story of the Punjab book.
Yeah, I've been reading the Punjab book and it's very thorough in in the analysis it's done. It's almost every paragraph is like flooded with references, which just shows your scholarly brilliance. And that's something I'd like to get into in this conversation. But before that, you talked about these figures being there who had written about these instances of the partition in Punjab and those sorts of things being Manto, among other names. So this is sort of like a hypothetical question, maybe not one of the serious ones out there, but this is generally something I ask my guests. So it's basically a hypothetical question that if you had an opportunity to sit down and just listen to a conversation of three intellectuals or three individuals who you admire, this could be from the past or the present, who would they be?
Three individuals having a
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah, and you're just like a fly on the wall. You can listen into a conversation.
Well, I wish I was there when Mahatma Gandhi and Jinnah met in 1944 for the prolonged discussions. Then I would have wanted to be around when Nehru and Jinnah met again in 1947, I think, or 46, to negotiate whether the Muslim League could be brought into the government. I think these were the three players. Uh, uh, Maybe one would have wanted to know, and even what Patel was saying and what Maulana Azad was saying. But if I have to choose, then these three persons.
Do you think these individuals that you just listed, Nehru, Jinnah, Gandhi, like in some ways they sort of define how we sort of look at the subcontinent in the modern world? Like how,
Okay.
in some sense, there is a Nehruvian India which is in some sense getting lost with the
Yeah.
with the current party that's in power right now, compared to like an Islamic state that Pakistan is right now, which is also in contention as to should it have been a Islamic state, should it have been a secular state. So is that in some sense, do you almost see the lives of three individuals as in some sense how we look at the subcontinent in the modern world?
I would say that were it not for Mahatma Gandhi, the bloodshed which ultimately took place would have been many times more.
Yeah.
So he brought the soothing, healing effect, you know. And without Jawaharlal Nehru, there wouldn't be a modern, secular, inclusive, progressive India. Regarding Jinnah, I think he was a tragic figure. He just wanted the partition of India. I think if I were to really try to understand his psychological fixation, to prove that he was no second fiddle to Gandhi or whatsoever. But the Pakistan he has bequeathed is full of all those contradictions. And although people latch on to one of his speeches of 11th August, where he was very secular,
Hmm.
unbelievably secular, but that's the only speech of its kind. The rest is studded with references to Islam, with to a Muslim state, which would be an ideal democracy. So it's a hodgepodge of many ideas which Jinnah left behind. In the interpretation, then, which were the forces that came to dominate Pakistan? Those who believed in an Islamic Muslim type of state. So I think Jinnah is then uh, the Pakistan he uh, created had all those potentials which have now uh, you know left their imprint in an indelible manner. It's very difficult to dislodge it. One can even then wonder if Nehru's secular state has not faced a similar challenge. And I would say in India, the battle for a secular, inclusive democracy continues. In Pakistan, it was lost already on the first day. That's the difference.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Many people who sort of look at the subcontinent and look at, let's say, partition studies also have this sort of question that generally comes up, is that was the partition inevitable? Like, was it something that, as you know, there are thinkers who were back in the day talking about these things like Ambedkar, even Jinnah, that it, it is inevitable because there are two conflicting ideologies that are living together. So in some sense, you need each of them to have their own space where they can live peacefully. Would you completely buy that argument, or would you say that it would have been possible for one united India in some sense?
I think if there was one united India, there was 1,000 years of experience of living together, of accommodating, of uh, you know intervening to diffuse the situation. All this was part of the 1000 years of experience of this region. Partition was a new thing, it had no precedent historically. And if you look at India Pakistan relations, has that promise been realized that you divide these people and there will be peace? It's the other way around. Both are nuclear power states who, if they resort to this arsenal, can impose such destruction that for the next several thousand years we will have no civilization in this region. So partition has not solved, if at all there was a Hindu Muslim problem. First of all, of the 90 million, 95 million Muslims, 35 million were left in India. And if Jinnah wanted to save Islam and Muslims, this is what he kept on saying, then they all should have been in Pakistan because they were in the Hindu majority provinces where they were the weakest. And most of them were poor people as well. So, in a moral sense, also, I think the partition really partitioned the Muslim community of the subcontinent.
Yeah.
The Hindus were driven out, the Sikhs were driven out, and they consolidated later on in East Punjab and in the rest of India. But the Muslims are now divided between India and Pakistan, and since 71, even in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
So, I'm not convinced that, first of all, I don't think partition was inevitable. It was one of the possibilities, definitely. If two people can't live together, you give them separate states, and maybe that's one solution. After the First World War, uh, Turkey and Greece exchanged their populations, after the war. But remember, there was a bloody war which resulted in hundreds and thousands of lives being lost. So one can't say this was like a peaceful transfer. It
Mhm.
was peaceful only in the sense that it was preceded by a bloody war. Okay. So no partition really is normally a successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe a few cases when both sides agree and both sides have their own different spaces to live in.
But with the example of Turkey and Greece, don't you think that even if it is a state that where, let's say, both uh, both, let's say, sets of people of different traditions, different cultures, different religions live together, in some sense there is still one of those cultures which tries to dominate over the other, however much we may like it or not. So with the example that you gave of Greece and Turkey as well, that's what's happening in the modern day with with the conflict of Cyprus, in some sense, because in Cyprus as well there's a big Greek population, and there's always Turkish invasion of how they feel that it's their land. So
Yeah.
in some sense, do you feel that that is inevitable, and you need, in some sense, leaders who have a vision that no, it's not only the majority community that gets to say how the nation state will run?
Yes, I think India was a great example of a vision of India in which everybody had a place. But the partition undermined it, and its consequences then are visible to us in the last 75 years. And actually, uh, the worst arguments in the partition, that Hindus and Muslims are two different nations, they have nothing in common, if taken seriously, then this is what has happened makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
India and Pakistan are at loggerheads all the time. And in India, now there is a problem with the Muslim minority, although the BJP keeps on uh, um, denying that there is a that the Muslims are beleaguered. They say
Yeah.
so is not the case, but we know that elections even are won on a anti-Muslim sort of propaganda.
And don't you
So
think that is the most, sorry to cut you off, but don't you think that is in some sense the most worrying thing for people who are living in modern India, that it's almost that and many people have talked about this in the public landscape, that whatever many of these Hindus, and I think in the Punjab book you've sort of titled this as well, that there was always this sort of feeling, but people were hesitant to voice it out. Let's say against the other community, and that might have been not just with the Hindus to the Muslims, but vice versa as well. But it wasn't as such that there was one party was coming and saying that, oh no, now you can actually voice it in the public sphere or something of that sort. Whereas in some sense, uh, I whenever I open one of these Hindi newspapers, it's full of dog whistles and something of that sort, and that would have never occurred in the past. Or at least not to the extent that it's happening at the moment, where people aren't even hesitant of, let's say, talking about the other community in a very in a very abject manner. So don't you think that's what's most like problematic for a democratic country?
it is absolutely. It's majoritarianism which has become respectable, and allegedly the Muslims only harmed India. But I keep asking my Indian friends, if that is true, how come that in 700-800 years of dominating northern India, uh, only 20% of the population actually converted to Islam, 80% remain
Yeah.
Hindus. And my understanding is that those who came from Central Asia and established their dynasties and so on were like any other ruler who came, and once his power or his dynasty consolidated, they let the rhythm of the society continue as it is, with some exceptions, of course.
Yeah.
People who attacked Hindu temples and looted Hindu property, that's also true. But that could not have been a daily occurrence under Muslim rule, not at all. It must have been an exceptional periods when this happened.
And also, more and more we're sort of seeing in the public landscape, and I think you've talked about this as well, this aspect of revisionist history that's come about. So it's almost that every place that was possibly renamed during the Muslim rule has to go back to the original name that it was. And is
Quite.
it and is it also official? Is it also original if in some sense that was also given a name at some point? So like it's, I understand where the sentiment comes from, but when it becomes harmful towards the other, let's say, community, and how the people in their vicinity start looking towards the other community, I think that is what's problematic. But
It is.
you do a lot of history writing yourself, and you are a political scientist. Can you speak a little bit about this aspect of history writing? Like, how do you particularly see it? Do you think that it is inevitable that when a party that comes to power will want to faction their version of history? So there was this thinker back in the day named Thomas Carlyle, and he came about with this concept called the great man theory of history. I'm not sure if you know about it. So he talked about this aspect that history as we see it isn't about like what was actually, in some sense, what was actually there, because there were so many things that happened, but we only tell history through the great figures, through the great men, through the great wars that happened. So it's not it's in some sense I do agree with it, because it then says that, to me, why do I care about, let's say, a Peruvian farmer? I want to know about Napoleon. I want to know about Akbar. I want to know about these men who did something more for the society. So, like, how do, first of all, do you know this aspect of the great man theory of history, and if so, like, what do you think about it?
Actually, in my Jinnah book, this is one of the theories I've
Yeah.
uh, taken up and discussed, and that I say is very attractive to people who admire Jinnah. They think that Jinnah got Pakistan by virtue of his intelligence, his
Mm.
skills, his instincts, intuition as a lawyer, what argument to use when. And I say that must be granted. That he was a born leader cannot be questioned. But what about the context? Had the British not wanted a partitioned India, and had Congress not taken up stands which antagonized the British, maybe things would have been very different. So if you bring things, Jinnah, into the context of what was happening at that time, then Jinnah is very lucky that he got away with his brief, about why he wanted Pakistan. But then he got a Pakistan very different from what he had demanded. He wanted the whole of Bengal and Punjab to be given to Pakistan, which were partitioned. So he didn't get the Pakistan he claimed for the Muslims. Although that Pakistan too would have left one third of Muslims in India. And so for me,
Mm.
that is a flawed idea of the Muslim nation. Either the whole nation is assembled in one place, or there is no case for the Muslim nation having its own state.
Yeah.
So, so I mean, what really was the question? Didn't I
I
answer
mean, I
it?
mean, in some sense you did, but don't you feel that I don't agree with this particular point, but many in the Hindu right also talk about this aspect that the idea on which India was built on wasn't taken into consideration of all aspects of society. And in some
Okay.
sense, that is also criticism that is given to the Nehruvian India. And when Nehru came into power, that Nehru and Ambedkar, let's say, took the responsibility of the Hindu community on their own and put forward a Hindu code bill without consulting, let's say, the people who they perhaps like the Hindu community. And whereas that is almost inconceivable to have happened with, let's say, the Muslim community, the Parsi community, or anything of that sort. So what my general argument here is that many in the Hindu right also say that the manner in which we look at India today is through this Nehruvian Marxist leftist way of looking at India.
Okay.
And there hasn't been, in some sense, a comprehensive way of looking at history that is encompassing of all ideas of India. Because they say that, acha, idea of India is all right, but whose idea of India?
I think that is a valid argument, but if I were to look at the BJP and RSS idea of India
Yeah.
and the Nehruvian India, I would still prefer the
Yeah.
Nehruvian idea
Yeah.
of it. So my
Yeah.
argument is, of course, Jinnah's Pakistan had also different positions. There are people who are very angry with me that I don't accept that Jinnah was a secular, he wanted a secular Pakistan. I say he used it as an argument primarily to convince the Indian government not to drive 35 million Muslims out of India. Because had India done that, Pakistan would collapse within days.
Hmm.
So it was a very clever statement. He never returned to it again until his death. He reverts immediately to the Islamic aspect of Pakistan. Okay, so that's the way I. So which legacy of Jinnah has prevailed? That about Pakistan being some sort of an Islamic ideal state. Now, from one point of view, an ideal Islamic state is one where Muslims are citizens with certain rights and the minorities are only a protected community.
Hmm.
So, if one were to grant that sort of ideal Islamic state, for me, that is a medieval notion of citizenship and so on. So Pakistan is somewhere in between a modern Muslim state and an Islamic state. It's not an Islamic state comparable to Iran, for example, or Afghanistan under the Taliban. It still has elections, it has a parliament, and there is a free press, more or less, which keeps on raising its voice against the government in power. Imran Khan is daily attacked,
Yeah.
and so that has to be granted. Uh, so idea of India, yes, there can be many ideas of India, but the one I prefer is the one which I benefit from by living in Sweden.
Hmm.
It's a secular state. Nobody knocks at my door and says either you become a Christian or you pack up or leave.
Yeah.
I became a professor here without having any ethnic religious connections here. only on the basis of merit, you know, and so on. So I prefer where everybody has a fair chance of realizing their best qualities. India did even something exceptional. They introduced uh, reservations
Hmm.
for a historically disadvantaged group. That I think was very noble. So the Indian constitution must be admired for its humane nature, for its inclusive politics, and for taking sides on in behalf of the most oppressed parts of society.
Yeah.
That's what I prefer. So, of
But
course, if the Hindu right defines India, I'm sure they have an idea of India.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we are getting to see it a lot more nowadays, especially.
Yes.
But
Yes. Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
no, but Dr. Ahmed, like, what do you think? In some sense, do you feel that it comes down to an aspect of education that has to be pushed forward in schools, and in wider society as well, that people can then actually critically think for themselves as to which side they want to fall on? Do they want to fall on a reactionary side, which wants to take you back to the Vedic lifestyle, or do you want to actually be someone who is progressive and who wants technology and those sorts of things to have come about? Do you think, in some sense, is that through, let's say, the study of politics and the study of different disciplines that can be initiated in schools, that people can then actually start these conversations to happen? Because many a times people wouldn't have these conversations and would like this whole bhakti culture in India, that if there is someone, as you said, the great man theory of history, right? If there is a great man, it's almost his opinion becomes the opinion of the masses.
Quite.
uh,
Well, let me say like this that uh, repeat this question again, yeah.
sorry, my question's also very like tangential and long ended, but my
Yeah.
particular question is that do you feel that this aspect of critical thinking and this aspect of
Yes,
like
very good.
just
Let's
logic?
stop here
Yeah.
now. I get your question.
Yeah.
I think if I were to criticize Nehru in India and all is that they went immediately for the best institutions for higher education.
Hmm.
Mass education, bringing all children into school, that was left to the provinces
Hmm.
and was never a priority. And so a secular culture, an inclusive culture wasn't promoted at the ground level. There is a documentary made by a gentleman called Stalin from South India, where he has shown how Dalit children in village schools are systematically discriminated. They can't use the the main tap for drinking water, and they can't sit with the other children, and they still all go to school. So the old caste system lives side by side with getting literate. So if you look at that aspect of Nehru in India was a failure, or a was neglected.
Yeah.
And some people say that because he was a Brahmin, he didn't care much for for educating. He went for the intellectual class that he belonged to. Didn't care so much for the people at the bottom. I
That was
don't know.
also,
I don't know if that is a fair criticism of 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 him, but I've heard that
but that
from
was
people
also
who.
that was also one of the critiques that Jinnah had against the Congress, right? He's like, you say that you represent all Indians, but you're only a Brahmin Banya community. You're just a Brahmin Banya party that thinks that they're secular, but in some sense, it's not, because just look at the people who are representing you.
But that was the truth of Hindu society. I
Yeah.
mean, since when were Dalits ever welcome in a Hindu social gathering? Never.
No.
But still, I must say that uh, when the British were leaving in 1946 and Ambedkar went to talk to them, I'm talking about the cabinet mission plan, I think the 6th of April 1946. The cabinet mission told Ambedkar that we are leaving, and your best bet is to seek help of the Congress left. So within the left of the Congress, people understood that caste was a terrible thing
Mm.
for the oppressed people of India. But how many Dalits had been educated to become leaders except Ambedkar? To get to the top of the leadership, you needed to have a modern education. And the privileged classes, the well off classes, people came from such backgrounds. The same is true of the Muslim League. Jinnah and his supporters were, Jinnah was a self made man, but the rest were landlords mostly. So, what is true of the Congress in terms of its leadership background, in a way, is different because many people in the Indian National Congress came from the middle class and not the old landowning classes. Landowners were very few in the Congress. There was a large segment of the middle class in the Congress, but they were also upper caste. This is true. But
Yeah.
did the Congress deliberately keep the let me give you an example to sort of question this thesis. Uh, in the first in early January 1940, three leaders met at Muhammad Ali Jinnah's house in Bombay. Jinnah Sahib was the host. Then Periyar, the
Yeah. The
leader
South
from the
Indian.
south,
Yeah.
and Dr. Ambedkar. And for 3 4 days, they were, uh, talking to one another if they could form a party in which Muslims, South Indian Dravidians, and the Dalits could be one party. Uh, and there is a picture also I've seen later on. I mean, it's not in my Jinnah book, but there is a picture showing the three sitting there and talking to each other. Okay, so this is verifiable. Anyhow, no party was formed as an alternative to the Indian National Congress. Then on the 16th of January 1940, about 10 days later, Gandhi wrote a letter to Jinnah saying, "My dear Qaid Azam, I address you as the Qaid Azam because everybody now calls you Qaid Azam. You are the only leader who can form an alternative democratic party. The Muslims, Dalits, and the Dravidians feel that the Congress is an upper caste Hindu party. Why don't you join hands and form an alternative party and challenge the Congress, but within a united India?"
Yeah.
But Jinnah didn't want to have a party in which his leadership had to be shared with Ambedkar and with Periyar. And from what we know, the reaction of both these leaders was of great disappointment with
Mm.
Jinnah. I've given that in my book on Jinnah.
Yeah.
So I think that such an objection to the Congress existed is true, that it's an upper caste Hindu dominated party. But here was a possibility of forming an a, a, a counterweight to the Congress, and the three groups, if they had come together, that would be population wise almost the same.
Yeah.
Dalits, Muslims, and Dravidian South Indians. So, but Jinnah Sahib did not show any interest in it, and so it never happened.
And in some sense, I think I've heard in one of your talks that you'd mentioned that that were the four identities that Jinnah had identified, that what India comprises of. So he said that there are the Hindus, there are the Muslims, there are the Dalits, and then there are the Dravidians. So
No,
that
yeah, at
that
one point,
yeah, I
that's
think
when
he'd
he was
mentioned it.
in, yeah. Later on, I mean, it depends on when he was doing this counting.
Yeah.
So that's earlier. In
Yeah.
1937, he said there are four powers. Very interesting: the British, the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, and the princes.
Hmm.
The 565 princely states. So uh, that was in 1937. But earlier on, you are right. He said there are many nationalities in India and no Indian nation. And when he counted those nationalities, it was Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Dravidians, and Dalits. Okay,
Okay. Yeah.
that's the 30s, early 30s.
Wow. Um, I have to ask you this question. Obviously, I want to talk a little bit more about partition later on, but as you are a political scientist, I've heard you in a couple of your talks also mention that you have sympathies for the left and those sorts of things. And I don't think many people have sort of pointed that at you in many of the talks you've given. So I sort of want to ask you about, like, in terms of political philosophy, like, is there one that you sort of most inclined towards, or or do you think that there is one that is true and that most society should model themselves on, or do you think that it should always be an open board, that people of different ideologies and different ways of looking at the world should have their examples in their states?
Well, I would say that from a Marxist sort of commitment, I have moved more towards left social democracy. I think the basic equality of all human beings must be recognized and respected. But people are also very different from one another in their competence, in their creativity. So, society must have space for all this variation as well.
Mm.
So, freedom is also equally important. A balance between the two is the best. And as long as your ideology does not preach hatred a of a group of people and justify violence against them, I think there should be enough room for discussion, intellectual interaction.
Yeah.
So I would say that what Marxism helped me understand was that there were nothing comes from heaven. All what we have here is a result of man's doings, good and bad.
Yeah.
And only we can rectify them or we can make the situation worse. So I do not count in miraculous interventions of any sort. I try to look for material causes of material situations. Like
Don't
I
you?
say, for example,
Yeah.
Jinnah would not have succeeded had the Second World War not broken out and Congress had not committed some major blunders on which Jinnah successfully cashed. And finally, the British had to be convinced that partition was in their best interest. And that's what happened. So
Yeah.
all this is explained can be explained in terms of the material situation of that time. And when I say material, I don't mean economic reductionism, which is what dogmatic Marxism is always, you know, uh, doing in its
Mm.
writings. Maybe over several hundred years, the economic factor is important, but day-to-day politics has a lot to do with just the situation as it obtains. And for the British, dividing India was important because they thought that the Soviet Union would uh, expand its influence in South Asia, and India, with its caste system, would be uh, would be easy for communism to find its converts. So we should create an Islamic type of state as a frontline state, and I mean the evidence, the speeches and the arguments are all there in the Jinnah book.
Mm.
So it's nothing that I'm relying on speculation. I've given their actual documents where they say all this.
Do
Okay.
you, so that's really interesting to hear, and in some sense, I do agree with that people of different inclinations of how they view the world sort of translates into how they view politics as well.
True.
So if there is someone who is generally more compassionate and those sorts of things, you would say that that sort of translates towards a left-leaning approach of how they look at politics. And if someone is more about individual freedoms and individuality, that does translate about to this aspect of a more right-wing way of looking at the world. But don't you think that this, like, when it becomes like, the example I like to throw about is the example of America, where it's been 50-50, you could say so, for so many years. And I think that, and most people would think that that is great for a democracy to have. But do you think that what's happening now, if you are keeping track of the situation in America, that things are becoming very much polarized, of that it is again becoming that where the aspect of religion or God is removed, people sort of have something that they want to insert there, ki acha, there is something that will unite us or will give them meaning, and politics is often what takes the shape there. So do you think that even in a secular democratic state where, let's say, the state has no involvement in the religious landscape, politics or political ideas will almost take that space, and will sort of make people polarized?
Yes, I think looking at the facts of the last 40, 45 years, that seems to be true. I think too much intellectualized, rationalized analysis uh, is a temptation we academics and intellectuals would make. But the reality is exactly what you are saying. People are swayed by the strangest of prejudices
Hmm.
and conspiracy theories. And so that factor seems to have gained salience all over the world. There is a general lowering of standards of politics all over the world. Boris Johnson is, in power. He, he was found having a great time when this COVID thing happened, but he didn't resign,
And he lied about it, and
and he lied about it. He became the prime minister, and you
I mean,
had,
my so there's a very interesting thing to say about this. So I am in the UK. So my
yeah.
friends over here were telling me about this. Look, he's a disgrace. He's going to parties. He's doing this. He's doing that. And I'm like, I come from India. You don't even know. So if something like this would happen, that's all right. We're more
Nobody would
concerned.
give a damn there, because I remember one of the Ambani weddings.
Yeah,
It was such obscene display of wealth,
yeah,
unbelievable in such a poor country. But people came, in real style from all over the world, and nobody gave a damn.
yeah.
So this happens.
Or
Unfortunately, the whole idea about we being human beings sharing our woes and our happiness and all that is a very attractive thing to latch on. But the reality is uh, uh, very different.
also this aspect of showboating, which I see a lot of in politics, and that's what sort of really doesn't leave a good taste in my mouth. Where people, like, let's say, Narendra Modi comes out and says, I'm a chai wala, but then he goes and buys a 8,000 crore plane for himself, something of that sort, to almost. So it's not only him. There's so many politicians who are like that. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about, and as a political scientist, I wanted to ask you. Many people say that it doesn't matter how honest or truthful a person is. When they get into the system, everyone just almost bends to the system and becomes corrupt and becomes whatever the thing is. I, in some sense, hold a different opinion. I think that if one is really true to their moral standing, then it doesn't matter what sort of system it is that they're taking part in. Do you sort of fall in either boat, that it's the system that sort of changes individuals to what they become? Or do you think that there are individuals who can go beyond the system and still hold a moral framework?
I think they can go beyond the system, no doubt. Otherwise, we'll all become cynics, and there
Mhm.
would be no need for you and I discussing. We should just give up in despondence, in despair. No, I don't think so. I think in all such situations, somehow some people take up the question of honesty, integrity, and things somehow are kept under control. Otherwise it would be, uh, I will,
The law of the
yeah,
jungle. Yeah.
yeah, law of the jungle sort of thing. Sweden is a good example. Our new prime minister, who's a lady, at her place there was someone doing the cleaning job, and the media people found out that that woman didn't have even a work permit. So immediately this was taken up in the press, and the prime minister explained that she had nothing to do with this. It's only done through the regular sort of bureaucracy who sent her there. But I mean, people are really interested in knowing if the politicians who have been elected into office are, adhere to the norms
Hmm.
for which they are voted into power. So, or maybe small countries like Sweden can behave differently than, let's say, something like the United States of America, where you have all the lobbying lobbies. You have the rifle club, which overrules all attempts to ban, firearms.
Yeah.
You have the military industrial complex
Hmm.
producing weapons sold all. So American democracy got compromised at the begin, uh, sometimes after the Second World War, and since then uh, elections are held, and there is a difference, however, who's the president to a point. I think Obama did try to make some changes like the health care and all, but the society in general, uh, he couldn't carry the people with him.
Hmm.
American way of thinking is very different. Nothing from the state. They think anything done by the state is socialism, communism. That's the level
Yeah.
of American thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas the NHS in the
In the
UK,
UK.
and
Yeah.
it's taken for granted.
Hmm.
So it depends what sort of political culture and traditions have existed in a particular country.
So this is really interesting that you touch about this aspect of political cultures and these traditions. And I generally agree with this that the social fabric of a society, each society differs. And this was really fascinating for me when you were talking about this in your Punjab book. I think in the preface you were talking that in political science and in many social science disciplines there is always this sort of conundrum as to, are people really individuals, or are they like just parts of a group, as to
Yes,
like
right.
they can be moved away through whatever the group is thinking, and a group consciousness exists but not an individual consciousness. um
Right.
would you sort of that I- in some sense, do you think that is the core defining aspect of the right versus left thing, or however loosely we may sort of define it, of individualism versus collectivism? um and if
Well,
so, like, yeah.
I would say collectivism can also be evil, when it
Oh
becomes a
yeah.
mob.
Oh yeah.
When
For
it
sure.
becomes a mob. Uh, and individualism can be very noble, because in the Punjab partition, I show that whereas the mobs attacked, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs and killed them mercilessly, you do have examples of individual Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs going out of the way and helping people from the so called enemy community
Hmm.
at a great risk to their own lives. So I think somewhere in the overall context, the individual does matter, but the collective is the background in which things can happen. I'll give
Hmm.
you one example. There is this, I met a gentleman while doing my research on the partition, Sheikh uh, Muhammad Farooq. He was from Kapurthala state, And he said that at the time of partition, I was only a kid of about 4 or 5 years. My father had died, and uh, we were now surrounded by the Sikh Jathas. They would come and kill all the men, take away the young women, and maybe get rid of children and so on. But one Sikh who was a friend of his father, I think Santa Singh, he knocked at the door and said, BBG, to his mother, you get ready and I'll escort you to the refugee camp. So he put this fellow, this little boy, on his shoulders. His mother and three sisters, they were walking towards the refugee camp when a Sikh Jatha surrounded them, and they wanted to uh, uh, take the young, you know, uh, 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 women away and maybe kill the mother and this boy as well. When Santa Singh challenged them and said ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਗੁਰੂਆਂ ਨੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਿਰਫ ਇਹ ਹੀ ਸਿਖਾਇਆ ਹੈ, have the gurus taught you just this thing, what you're going to do? And the leader, the elderly man, he got off the horse, came and stood next to this fellow, this Sikh, and said, as Sikh nu apni zuban da man kaim rakhan diyo. If he gave his a pledge to help this family, let them do it. And he says, I was saved because of this. So here is a mob. Normally, the mob kills, takes
Mhm.
away all the women, all the property, kills the men around, but it didn't happen. So I would say that mm, people act in a context, but when they do, there are situations when their individual bravery, commitment, cowardice, it all plays a role.
Yeah. So there's generally this hypothetical that is played about that, for example, and it is really frightening to think about almost that, for example, if you were one of the soldiers in the Nazi party in Nazi Germany, or if you were one of the people of the in the Soviet Union, you were a soldier there, and if you were ordered to sort of go ahead with some killings or something of that sort, would you have been one of those individuals who would have stood out from the crowd and said that no, I'm not going to do it? Because for the most aspect of things, people are going to go ahead with it because they're going to be safe, right? And I think there was someone, a political scientist, who said that most people want to be safe and not free. And so it almost becomes that you need someone like an Oscar Schindler or someone like that who is so, let's say, wild that he will go beyond his safety to, let's say, take care of the people around him, so that yeah, just through normal human rights, that people don't get don't get consumed by the ideologies, and they think that the ideologies matter more than the individuals around them.
And that is why we have history, and history will never have an end. Because no social science, no prediction about the future can be absolutely watertight. There will always be exceptions and always be surprises.
Hmm.
Some people will stand out from the crowd and do things like this. And that is why it's fascinating to study the human
Yeah.
societies.
But what do you think? Because I think in your first chapter in the Punjab book was about ethnic cleansing, and
Yeah.
so my general question here is, and you've tried to explore it in depth, and you've mentioned several sort of people there as well. Like, if I just have to talk about the 20th century, like people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, all these individuals who went ahead with these heinous crimes, what do you think it is that almost consumes an individual so much that he thinks that if only I sort of faction this ideology on a society wide level, it doesn't matter if there are a few people who are killed here and there. I think that's exactly the words that Mao used, or those were the exact words that Stalin used, that yeah, we understand, but for the betterment of socialism and for socialism to enter the world, if there are a few people who die right now, the people who come down in the generations will remember the society we built. So
Yeah, I know that's a conviction of hardcore ideology fixated people. Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. But even so-called democracies have uh, uh, horrible conduct and they should be held accountable. Now look at this: the British Parliament we admire, um the 1215, what was it called? Magna Carta,
Yeah,
and
Magna
then
Carta. Yeah.
okay, but the same Parliament justified slavery. You know, slaves in the hundreds and thousands, maybe millions, were taken from Africa and transported to the United States. What about the white man coming to the Americas and killing
Mm.
of the local populations? So there is something wrong in terms of my group having the right to dominate. I think the urge to domination is inbuilt to in human nature, if you want to call it. I'm a bit hesitant to make such a strong statement. Machiavelli thought this was just our nature, that we want to dominate
Hmm.
because we want glory, we want power. Maybe that's true, but then there are alternatives where you can keep these things in balance.
Hmm.
So the rule of law uh, uh, can make a difference if it is applied seriously. If there is the rule of law and there is an open discussion going on, these are the saving graces of human beings finding outlets for critiquing what is going on and rectifying it.
But it comes down to that aspect of that rule of law being present, or that constitution that is being upheld to its right ways is present, because many of these places, that's why Churchill said, and I'm not a big fan of Churchill myself, but that's what he
No,
said, right? That all forms of government are bad, but democracy is just the worst, the best of the worst in some sense. So however much we may have our critiques of democracy, it still presents that equality of all individuals, and that rule of law presents itself over, let's say, the rule of force or something of that sort.
I tend to agree with you,
Yeah.
but we have examples of restricted sort of democracy like Singapore
Hmm.
and some of these societies in Southeast Asia. When I was there, I was very impressed by the Singaporean model. There wasn't a free press. There was only one newspaper
Hmm.
where the government uh, position was every day, you know, published and so on. So not democracy as you have in India, the argumentative Indian, for example, many newspapers, talk shows, nothing of the sort. But people were guaranteed their security, and it is a very peaceful society. Very little crime takes place.
Yeah.
So it depends on what sort of society is there and what sort of cultural uh, legacies are
Yeah.
present in a certain situation.
But Dr. Ahmed, don't you think that it also comes down to what kind of a society you want to live in? Because don't you think, and you're a political scientist, so you'd know this much better than I do, that this was in some sense the difference between Aristotle and Plato, right? Where Plato said that no, it's more important how long a civilization lives. But Aristotle is no, it's not important how long it lives, but how it lives. So you could have a society that lives for eons, but if you don't have that aspect of freedom within a society, then is it really a society to live in? Like, for example, many of the people, like the Chinese Communist Party, in some sense, for the people from the outside, yes, we can critique it for its, let's say, there's no democracy, and the treatment of the Uyghur population, which is in my essence reprehensible. But when you also look at aspects of how they've lifted people out of poverty and those sorts of things, it is really difficult to sort of balance it, and I think that is what political science is, to find that balance of how you walk that path.
Quite right. That's why I gave the example of Singapore,
Yeah.
which was only a fishing village in 1965. And now it's a very prosperous part of the world. And China is another example that you give. It's not easy to pass judgment on it because they have
Yeah,
lifted millions out of poverty.
for sure.
And
Yeah.
yet it's not a free society. Any opposition is repressed. Uh, People are sent to prison and kept there. And then this Uyghur Muslims,
Mm.
their situation, it's reprehensible, as you say, and I totally agree.
Uh,
So one can take a utilitarian position sometimes. If the majority is benefiting, then it is good. And one can hope that at some point within China, people will want democracy and there will be a transformation.
yeah.
This is what people also hope will happen in Russia ultimately. Maybe this war that Putin has started may get out of control for him
Hmm.
and expedite his exit. I mean, I was looking at some of the things people were saying, and I'm sharing them with you. Although I
Also,
think,
so yeah, yeah,
although I think uh, this war in Ukraine could have been avoided had the Ukrainian government given assurances that they are not going to join NATO.
yeah.
Why do they need to join NATO, Yar? Explain to me. Why? You can join the European Union, so
Mm.
benefit as much as you can from the economic possibilities. Sweden and Finland are also members of the European Union, but they are
Mm.
neutral states. So this was a provocation, but should Putin have gone in all out with his army and invaded Ukraine, we can never justify that, but we have to still understand why he did.
Yeah.
So that's what we are doing now, you
And
and I. Yeah.
isn't that what is most fascinating? Because I saw that video of yours on the Ukraine crisis that has happened recently. But I've also heard many other people who talk about this aspect that while we identify Ukraine as a sovereign country, we then put these limitations on them. Acha, then, but why do they have to join NATO or something of that sort? So, in some sense, you have freedom, but there are always limitations on your freedom because um, people would not like to admit this, but it is the American global empire that we are living in some sense.
But
And
isn't look at what the Americans themselves have done.
yeah,
The Cuban missile crisis.
hmm,
Cuba was placing uh, nuclear missiles on its soil, which would have threatened US security. And so the Americans wanted to go to all out war over it.
yeah, yeah,
But they had missiles placed in Turkey and in all these places directed against the Soviet Union.
hmm,
How do you apply two principles? Then Elande of Chile was an elected Marxist president. He wasn't a dictator. The CIA engineered a coup against him and had him overthrown, and it was a violent overthrow. He was killed. Many other Chileans were killed. So, what have the Americans not done
exactly.
to enhance their own security?
Yeah,
They came all the way to Iraq,
Libya,
destroyed Saddam
Afghanistan. Yeah,
Hussein's. Okay, he was an dictator, but what have they left behind? A bleeding Iraq, out of which came ISIS, and then you have their main enemy, Iran, actually being the main beneficiary of the destruction of Saddam Hussein. And now Blair, they have given, he's been knighted. I've
hmm.
been told. Is it not true?
I haven't seen, but
You
Tony Blair,
haven't
you're
seen?
talking.
Then maybe this is not true because somebody was telling me this, and I haven't read it myself. They
Yeah,
say
I'm
that.
not. Tony
Okay.
Blair. Okay, I'm not sure, but don't you think this is in some sense more dangerous than, let's say, hard power, this aspect of soft power that America and many other places in the West are sort of implementing, that they go like, why does the US care if Afghanistan has to look like New Jersey? Like, why do they have to go to Afghanistan and tell them that no, 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 you have to implement democracy, otherwise you're not a perfect state or something of that sort? Don't you think that in itself is, however, we may not see it that way, it is in some sense spreading that American ethos around the world and the
Eh,
modern world. Yeah.
Yeah, but exactly. But then can't one also argue that Putin doesn't like
Hmm.
Ukraine becoming a satellite of the West through NATO?
Yeah.
What's the difference? If they want to impose democracy on Afghanistan all the way from the United States because that's what they think is right, Putin is doing the same,
Yeah.
only in the West. Putin is the villain, but not what the Americans do. They promote peace, democracy, freedom, all that. And
Yeah.
yet the Americans have supported the worst dictatorships in Latin America,
Hmm.
and Saudi Arabia and all, were their best allies. So they have had no problems in having good relations with dictators themselves.
For
So this is
sure.
not even-handed policy. American, uh, they think that the world should be recast in the light of their ideal
Yeah.
idea of freedom and individualism and so on. And it's not easy.
Also, in some sense, I would like to connect this to how people sort of view, like, the Hindu right sort of sees the idea of India that Nehru, Sardar Patel, Gandhi, all these people sort of conceived of. Because even they say that only in skin you're Indian, but in like intellect, thoughts, tastes, everything you're English. And in some sense, you can make that argument because the argument is that where are like the Sanskrit traditions, where are like the language we speak, everything else, the way people conceive of the nation is in some sense, you may not see it that way, but it is built on a Christian ethos, or something of that sort, that is trying to be spread through the United States, through England. Do you see any sort of validity in that argument? The people's like, I don't know. There's this recent historian who has got like a lot of criticism because of plagiarism in India. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, Vikram
Uh,
Sampath.
yeah,
Yeah. So that was
I
his.
wrote a comment saying that the worst sin we commit as academics is plagiarism.
Yeah.
So if he's a plagiarist, for me, he's no historian. He's a dishonest man when it comes to dealing with uh, contentious issues in history.
Yeah, he's a
If he is
hagiographer.
plagiarized, if this is correct, then this
Yeah.
is unforgivable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but in some sense, what do you make of that idea? Do you think there is validity in this argument that the modern Indians are only Indians by skin, but in terms of intellect, tastes, everything else, they're pretty much Western, and they want like a Western conception to be put forward.
But can't one turn the argument to the idea of authentic Indian idea of whatever is right and wrong? Would then not caste
Mm.
system be the basis of the
Yeah.
society that you should really establish? Should not the Dalit be driven back into, he's actually not part of the Varna system at all.
Yeah.
So where in that Vedic India, I mean, or let's say post Vedic, before Islam and Christianity, did the oppressed people really have any good standing in society? No.
No.
So Western, I look at these things in terms of what is universal is for everyone, and it doesn't matter where it originates.
Mm.
Don't the Indians claim that they invented the zero and
Yeah.
they've given the whole world the zero, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if the zero from India can really revolutionize mathematics, it proves it is a universal discovery. And it's no longer, it originated in India, but it transformed the whole discipline of mathematics or arithmetic, whatever you want to call it. So things which are universal, it doesn't matter where they originate. If I think human rights are for every individual having the right to dignity, the right to protection of the law, not to be uh, uh, dealt with arbitrarily, but under the laws of the state. All these ideas are good for individuals as they are.
Yeah.
That they originated in the West doesn't really matter. After all, the tanks and the cars and the software they are using, none of this has an Indian origin. They are all inventions in the West, which with which people all over the world are trying to make use of.
Ishtiaq sir, we
What
don't
about
know
you
them,
and
but
I talking,
yeah.
right now? Did it come from the Islamic civilization or the Indic civilization? Not at all. So these are
But
silly ideas. These are
yeah,
silly ideas.
but Ishtiaq sir, like they would take it so far that I've heard some of them even say that like the coding that's happening nowadays should be done in Sanskrit because apparently that is more I don't know, that is more easy for computers to read or something of that sort. So many of these people, and I think you've touched about this in a couple of your videos, that the conception of the Hindu right, that what Hindu nationalism is built on, and this aspect of Akhand Bharat is of this aspect that where they're even trying to critique the Aryan invasion theory, that it was not really the Aryans who came into India and lived through through generations, but it's more that this is being propagated now, the out of India theory. So it was the
Yeah,
Indians
yeah,
who went out and sort of civilized the world or something of that sort.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, and that is in some sense what is I would say that obviously those sorts of arguments should be there, but it should be done through a peer reviewed process where people can actually go and critique the work. So you can have your Aryan invasion theory and you can have the out of India theory, but let
I have another question which I would like to pose through you to
yeah.
my uh, Hindu
In the right.
right friends. They talk about what is happening in Pakistan is the karma and so on. Okay, I hear it every daily.
Yeah.
They must explain to me what was done wrong by the Hindu civilization that for more than 1,000 years foreigners came and ruled
Hmm.
India and they were enslaved according to their own litany.
Hmm.
How do they explain that? There must be something seriously flawed in the
The
Indian Hindu
general,
civilization that foreigners came, defeated them, and started ruling.
but
So, what is that karma story? How do you explain
yeah.
karma, ultimately deciding your fate? So,
Dr. Ahmed, it's this aspect that is again very dangerous, that is happening again, right? It's this aspect of victimhood that's come about, and this was the same this aspect of victimhood, Hindu
victimhood,
victimhood,
yeah, 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 yeah.
and this is such a dangerous concept in my opinion, because if you look through history with the civilizations that played on this role a lot more, like let's say if you look at the oppressors and the oppressed in Soviet Union, or if you look at let's say the Nazis in Nazi Germany, or anywhere of that sort, where this aspect of victimhood was really played out, that it was only the Jews, and the Jews are stealing everything, they're marrying
Right.
your women, they're getting the jobs, and that's what translated to this aspect of hatred. And so the Hindu right would say that it was because the Hindus didn't have a shared, there was a general conception of the land they lived in, but everyone was first, let's say, a Marathi, or first Bengali, or first South Indian, and then maybe second a Hindu or something of that sort. and and they say that because there wasn't unity in their diversity, that these people could come and rule over us. That's why
Okay, good. So
that's why
they have
Savarkar,
opened.
yeah.
So they are admitting it then, huh?
Yeah.
There was something seriously missing in the Indian situation.
Hmm.
Right? I would grant that. I wouldn't have a problem in accepting that. So I'm saying rectify that. Never let India be enslaved or invaded by another power. Be strong,
Yeah.
assert your freedom, but doing it in a way as victims is uh, to be self-critical is good, but to resort to this victimhood sort of thing is has a negative connotation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can rectify what is wrong in your own civilization and become better. That I can understand.
I
So
totally agree. I totally agree.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the way I look at it. I mean, of course, the West came and brutalized many societies. Uh, Latin America societies almost disappeared. India didn't. India lasted with its 5,000 years. Some people say 25,000 years old
No.
temples and all. I don't know how they do this counting, yeah. Historical record is 2,000, 2,500 years,
Huh.
recorded history.
Yeah.
Before there is archaeology,
Hmm.
and now we have DNA. These are
Hmm.
the levels. But I keep hearing, no, 25,000 years ago, this great invention was done by Hindus and so on. What can you do with this? I mean, they say this is historically true.
Yeah, but where are the Hindus right now? Like they're all running away to America. So like if the land was so great, then they would have stayed, right? So
So this is all like a lot of vanity is involved now, that we are a great civilization, and we have to blame others
hmm.
for all the harm they did us. I'm sure a lot of harm was done by the invaders and so on, but there must be something wrong within you that this could happen.
Yeah.
And I think the caste system was one. Let me tell you, when I was doing this research on the partition, a friend of mine, Yuvraj Krishan from Lahore, and then I met him in Vasant Kunj again. I mean, I didn't know him from Lahore. I met him in India. He
Hmm.
was senior, yeah. He said that up until the 30s in the Punjab, the Brahmin, the Khatri, and the Vaishya could not sit together and eat, uh, you know, from the same.
Yeah.
They were served food separately. So if you have so many, divisions within your own upper castes, what about the OBCs and then the people at the bottom? How do you explain that as a strength of your civilization? No, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
Others came and dominated you because you were divided within yourself. So there is nothing so grand about the uh, Indic civilization.
Yeah.
Of course, it achieved many grand things and gave the world the zero, of course, but then remained zero itself. that
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
horrible thing to say, but this is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is, in some sense, why Savarkar's conception of Hindutva is so different to Hinduism, and that's why many people in India also shy away from, let's say, Hindutva, because if you sort of track it to its roots, that Savarkar and Gorwarkar, who actually conceptualized this idea on a large front, they actually took it from Nazism. They said that what the Nazis did, in some sense, yes, people will critique them, but in terms of the extermination of the other, let's say, civilization, they were totally able to do that. And I think this was what Hitler said as well when he had gone ahead with the argument that people will critique us, but who today remembers the Armenians? So he was referring to the Armenian genocide that happened back in the day, and that was horrific and brutal as well. But do you think that this is true, that it is only a certain number of time where people forget? So however brutal a thing may be, if there is, let's say, a span of years that goes ahead, people will inevitably forget about the instances that happened in the past, your Genghis Khans of the world, your Armenian genocide. And would we say the same thing about the Nazi regime as well, maybe 100, 200 years down in the future?
Who knows? Because 200 years from now, uh, people would be detached from these conditions
Yeah.
and probably would take a different position than we who are living in these times. One thing probably which would make a difference is that because of the internet, Facebook, and all these facilities, what is happening today is documented much better than what was possible in the past. So, like this war in Ukraine, we can see daily the events which are taking place. So, it's very difficult to hide your crimes now. But maybe 200 years from now, even this becomes a source of entertainment that, well, a war took place and this thing happened, and so on. But uh, that doesn't mean that that's the right way to go forward.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because what happened to Hitler and the Japanese state, we also must take into account.
Yeah.
They paid a very heavy price for that.
Um, I was really interested to also talk to you about your book, The Pakistan Garrison State: Origins, Evolution, Consequences from
Okay.
1947 to 2011. Um, and I think you have touched about in this interview as well, when Jinnah, the different conceptions he had. And I think I've heard you in a different interview saying that where he did win the case for Pakistan as a state, there was virtually no vision as to how the state should function. And you
Right.
mentioned that the people who are, let's say, from a secular bent often quote his speech that Pakistan should be a secular state. But people from an Islamist viewpoint say that, but why then demand a Pakistan or something of that sort? So, what was your general inkling of writing this book, and what do you think this book was able to achieve?
Well, the Garrison State book, I think you are confusing the two or connecting the two, Jeddah and Garrison State book. In
Okay,
the
yeah, yeah.
In the Garrison State book, I tried to explain why two states which came into being on the same day, one went on to become an elected democracy and the other failed.
Mm,
So why the supremacy of civilians was not established in Pakistan? That was the main concern. And so in that book, I show that the type of Pakistan which emerged out of the partition was indefensible in case India were to attack Pakistan. And I think the British must have planned it this way, that let Pakistan, well, if they want Pakistan, this is the Pakistan we give them, because the Pakistani leadership, already before Pakistan came into being, Jinnah sent Isfahani, his right hand man, to the United States to plead with the Americans not to oppose the creation of Pakistan, saying that we will serve as your frontline state, not only in South Asia but also in the Middle East, because we have cultural ties with the
yeah.
Middle East. And the Muslim League was no political party comparable to the Indian National Congress. It was a collection of forces, local, regional, who did not want the end of Zimidari system, who
Mm,
wanted to protect their privileges in Pakistan. Once Pakistan came into being, the Muslim League lacked a vision of how to go about making Pakistan democratic and federal. So, two principles have collided in Pakistan: how to make Pakistan a federal state. It has, for most, it has mostly functioned like a quasi unitary state, with
mm,
the center being overbearing, huh? Or it has been either some sort of a liberal Muslim type of state or an Islamic state with with dogmatic laws also included in the legal system and in the constitution. So uh, that's what I mean, that Pakistan became a garrison state because the only institution which could give it stability and continuity was the Pakistan military.
mm,
So it has stepped in because the politicians failed over and over again. We got the first constitution only in 1956, but there were no elections until 1970. The first national election, free election, free and fair, was in 1970, and it culminated with the breakup of Pakistan. So, which has been the stabilizing factor? The fact that we have had an effective military as an institution, for good and bad.
Yeah, I think there is one quote of yours where you say that most nations have an army, but in the case of Pakistan, the army has a nation.
That's correct. The second thing about uh, the Jinnah book, well, I have shown that the 11th August speech is just one speech of its kind. Nothing precedes it and nothing follows after it. This speech is on the 11th of August, but on the 14th of August, when the Pakistan Constituent Assembly was actually inaugurated, Mountbatten, who had come to represent the British monarch, got up and said, "Now you have your own state,
Hmm.
and you have, uh, the model of Akbar as a great
Yeah.
ruler, and hopefully Pakistan would be uh, taking inspiration from such rulers." And Jinnah gets up and says, "Well, Akbar is all right, but our main source of inspiration is Prophet Muhammad, who first defeated the Jews and Christians and then treated them ideally." So he brought in the Islamic factor immediately 3 days after he made this allegedly secular speech.
Hmm.
And then I have given many instances. He wrote to the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al Banna, to send a scholar to come to Pakistan and tell them how to make Pakistan an ideal Muslim state. You know the Muslim Brotherhood,
Hmm.
Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Then the only department he established was the Institute of Islamic Reconstruction in Lahore, where whose uh, uh, whose task was to advise Pakistan government how to become a true Islamic state, have an Islamic economy, an Islamic educational system. Then on the 25th of January 1948, when he addressed people, members of the Karachi Bar Association, he said, he was irritated and said, "Why do people keep asking me what will be the constitution of Pakistan? The constitution of Pakistan was given 1300 years ago, which means from the origins of Islam, and it will be a democracy which will take care of its minorities and so on." And then finally, in July or June 1948, soon after thereafter he died,
Yeah.
while inaugurating the Pakistan State Bank, he said, "We don't want any isms. We want you to give us guidelines how to build an Islamic economy." So all those speeches and all those statements are also part of his legacy. And just one speech where no Islam is mentioned, but no secular, the word secular is also missing there.
Hmm.
He could have given the example of Turkey as what he thought was a state to emulate. But he says, no, we should learn from the British. But the British took several centuries to become a sort of liberal uh, 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 democracy.
Democratic. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
So,
that's the way I look at the Pakistan situation. Yeah.
in singling out Jinnah in particular, do you think he was one of those individuals who was very Machiavellian in his own way? So if there was an individual who was, let's say, more secular bent, and he came to him saying that, Acha, how should the conception of Pakistan be and on what grounds? Then he would give him a certain answer. But if someone else came to him who was, let's say, more Islamic, then he would give them another answer. Do you think that was a lot that played into Jinnah's idea when he was sort of arguing for a Pakistan?
Of course, I demonstrated over several pages how he made contradictory promises to different sections of the Muslims.
Yeah.
Indeed, this is absolutely the case, which in Pakistan nobody wants to admit. To the ulama, he said, of course, in
Yeah.
a state founded for Muslims, it's unthinkable that we would have a state which would be contrary to Islamic values and principles and so on. And in the election campaign in 1945-46, the ulama went around propagating an ideal Islamic state, and then he's on record giving a promise to the Pir Sahib of Manki Sharif, a powerful spiritual leader of the Northwest Frontier province, that uh, indeed in a constituent assembly where 75% of the members would be Muslims, all laws and the constitution would reflect Islamic values and principles. But to the British, he kept on saying that democracy is in our blood, Islam is democratic, and things like this. But he never ever used the word secular for Pakistan, not even once.
So
Not even in this fabled 11th August 1947 speech, which everybody invokes.
yeah.
The word secular is missing.
Dr. Ahmed, do you think that later on, when Pakistan did come into being, you also talk a little bit about this aspect that which Islam is the right Islam, because there were different interpretations that started to play out of Islam as well. And later down the line, I think you've also mentioned that when Ali Bhutto came into power, there were different approaches to, let's say, land owning that were implemented. Whereas where you talk about that there were different interpretations of the Islam, and people who were of the socialist bent were saying that no, Islam preaches socialism, or
Yeah.
maybe some people who were of the capitalistic aspect of things said that no, Islam has no boundaries as to how much land you can own. So can you also maybe give us a little brief about when Pakistan did come into being, the conflicting clashes that were there within, let's say, the Islamic faith of people who wanted to build a nation but had different conceptions of how the nation should be built on Islamic lines.
Absolutely. I mean, there is this Munir report written after the anti Ahmadiyya riots in Punjab in 1953, where the two judges who were presiding, Justice Munir and Justice Kiani, they write, no two ulama could agree before us in defining a Muslim. Each one of them had a different conception of who is a Muslim. And this is people who belong to the same school of thought within Islam. Apart from that, the fact is that the Muslims were as divided as Hindus, let's say, Hindus, if we can say, on caste, the
Hmm.
Muslims on sect. The Sunni Shia conflict originated at the very advent of Islam and continues to this day. Then within the Sunni majority, there are different sects. The more uh, Sufi oriented, but now the most militant Barelvis. Then you
Hmm.
have the Deobandis, the left wing of the Deoband, the majority, they supported the Indian National Congress, but some of them broke away and joined the Muslim League. Then you have the Ahle Hadith, who are Wahhabis, Saudi oriented, and none of them accept each other as full Muslims. They think they their belief is flawed, and they have declared one group completely out of Islam, the Ahmadiyya. And so this happened when there was no Hindu and Sikh to point a finger at. It was within Islam. The second problem was that Pakistan had different linguistic nationalities: Bengalis, Punjabis, Pakhtuns, Sindhis, Baloch.
Hmm.
And the federal issue has not been resolved. Well, there is an 18th Amendment now, but it's not been implemented yet fully. So they also fell out in terms of what sort of a federation Pakistan would be. As long as East Pakistan was part of Pakistan, they tried to negate the majority of the Bengalis by on the basis of the principle of parity, equal
Hmm.
representation for both parts of Pakistan. Although the Bengalis were 55%, Then, when this was removed in 1970 and the Bengalis got 55% representation, they the Awami League alone could get enough seats. In 300 seats, they got 161, I think, and were entitled to form the government, and that was not acceptable to West Pakistani power holders. And so there was the civil war and Pakistan broke up. So within the Muslim community, all those contradictions of sect, subsect, ethnicity, or let's say language continue to be endemic and continue to dictate politics. So Jinnah's genius was to somehow hide all this and present. I give this example that the Congress's dilemma was that it was a secular party
Hmm.
and it had some leading Muslims in its leadership ranks. So it could not launch a campaign against Islam. They just could not.
Yeah.
The Muslim League was an entirely Muslim party. For them to attack Hinduism was natural if they were to get Pakistan.
Yeah.
So, in a way, the Congress was handicapped. They didn't take up the contradictions within Islam as to counter, you know, uh, uh, the claim of Jinnah that the Muslims were a homogeneous uh, community, one nation. They just didn't do that. So that's been another problem. But Jinnah somehow succeeded in mobilizing all these people, giving them different promises, and all those promises have come to haunt Pakistan once he was gone. As long as he was there, nobody dared question him.
Yeah.
He made some decisions which were entirely undemocratic, dismissing elected governments.
And I think
You know,
you've also mentioned in recent talks that in some sense people still don't question Jinnah because in the history writing that's done, and you like I think you've mentioned that you've had some beef with Alisha Jalal, who's almost painted a picture of Jinnah without using any of his speeches or any of the things he's actually said, but almost writing a fiction as to of what Jinnah actually wanted in the conception of Pakistan. So
quite right. The book is here. If you want, I can show it.
feel free.
No, no. The Sole Spokesman, this is the title of the book.
Yeah, yeah.
Then the subtitle is Jinnah, the Muslim League, and the Demand of Pakistan. So the sole spokesman is both Jinnah and the Muslim League for the Muslims of India. Fine. How can, when you say the spokesman, what did Jinnah speak? Not a single speech from 1906 to the day he died is given in the book. And she claims that from 1939 onwards, Jinnah was, campaigning for a power sharing deal within a united India between Muslims and Hindus as two equal nations. And that it was the Congress which forced partition on Jinnah. I have then, I was never convinced about this, but scholars tend to, in good faith, sort of accept. And her research was very popular with the left in Pakistan.
Okay.
So when I started looking at the speeches, the story is entirely diametrically opposite. I have said from 22nd March 1940. Now, remember that.
Hmm.
That's one day before the Lahore resolution is uh, moved. Go through the speeches of Jinnah, all his speeches. Just bring one speech, one statement, one message, interview anywhere where he has said, we want a power sharing deal with the Indian National Congress. No. Nothing of the sort. The only time where he says we want India partition, I mentioned that the Lahore session of the Muslim League was from 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th of March 1940. The same day when the Lahore session ended, Jinnah gives a press conference. And in the press conference, he says that we have made a historic demand which is for the division of India. Aisha Jalal doesn't even
Yeah.
mention that press conference, which is part of the ongoing session of the Lahore session. And then from that day onwards, Jinnah, with unbelievable constancy, you know, uh, unflinching emphasis, says we want partition. He tells the Muslims and the Hindu Muslim majority provinces, you are bound to be a minority, so don't stand in the way of the majority Muslims of Northeast and Northwest. And this he says in Delhi, the same he says in Bombay, and then all the way in Madras and in Ahmedabad. Don't stand in our way. We want Northeast and Northwest to become independent. And then when he was challenged in Kanpur that what will happen to us, he
Mm.
says, this is 30th of March 1941. He says, I'll have 2 crore Muslims. 2 crore is 20 million. Actually, he should have said 30 crores, 30 million, 3 crore, because that's what was left in India. I would have 2 crore Muslims experience martyrdom, shahadat, and get smashed in order to liberate 7 crore Muslims. Actually, it should have been 6 crore Muslims to be the correct figure. So here is someone saying, I want the Muslim minority in the Hindu majority provinces to be smashed. So
Mm.
if the BJP and RSS are allegedly now doing that, Jinnah was prepared for all this to get Pakistan. Jinnah wanted Pakistan and he used all those arguments which would justify the division of India. Simple as that.
Wow. Um, Dr. Ahmed, like the little I know of Jinnah's early life, when he was in the UK as a student, many people, and I think many secular people also in Pakistan, have talked about this aspect that he was really influenced by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and their conception of, let's say, as a classical liberal. And I think in the UK he also called himself a classical liberal. Why didn't that aspect sort of play out when there was a conception of Pakistan? So he couldn't he have built, let's say, a Pakistan on classical liberal lines, or on secular democratic lines? Or do you think he he was always unable because he wanted to please both sides of the Islamic individuals don't move away from him and he loses major votes? My general question is that why didn't he sort of implement it
Well,
if he
the classical liberal uh, was fully expressed during his first phase as the Indian nationalist.
okay, yeah,
There he is a full blooded liberal. He dismisses all suggestions that religion matters. He says we are all Indians
hmm,
and we want self government and self rule and all that. And he's very critical of British policies. It's only when Gandhi comes in and assumes the leadership, under Gandhi, Congress becomes a mass party.
yeah,
And Jinnah was uncomfortable with mass politics, civil disobedience and non cooperation. He didn't like those, uh, uh, you know, uh, uh, mass politics of Gandhi.
yeah,
And so he left Congress. And then when he assumed the leadership of the of the Muslim separatist movement, thereafter his liberalism and his individual whatever is subordinated. I mean, it all disappears to the dichotomy he drew between Hindus and Muslims as two hostile nations. So the the total weight of the ideas he then injected into his campaign is overwhelmingly Islamic and communal. Having done that and getting Pakistan, I have this is what I've argued. People have had great difficulty in understanding this, that a leader or the creator of an idea uh, doesn't control the idea he has produced once it becomes part of mass consciousness.
Hmm.
So once he had created this wall between Hindus and Muslims and demanded the partition of India, and that partition had cost 1 million lives, 14 million people driven out of their homes, with women raped and abducted and children killed, in horrible ways. Then to say that Pakistan is going to be another secular, it's going to be India B, secular democratic state, made no sense.
Yeah.
The 11th August speech then connects maybe to his early commitment as a liberal. But was he serious about it? We don't know, because on the 14th, when Mountbatten mentioned Akbar, he got up and contradicted him and said Prophet Muhammad is our example. So that's not a liberal example to
Yeah.
give.
Yeah.
And then I've given you all the other instances where he writes to the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood
Hmm.
to send some scholar to tell Pakistanis what to do in order to become a true Muslim state. That's one. Then I've given you the other things as well.
Dr. Ahmed, like I wanted to ask you about like the relationship that Gandhi had with Jinnah, because I read in Ramchandra Guha's book on Gandhi, I think Gandhi, the Years That Changed the World. I think several times in the interactions between Gandhi and Jinnah, Gandhi had done so much to sort of keep, let's say, the Muslim, and to not have a partition, that he'd also mentioned that when we have independence, I will allow. I will give you the prime ministership of United India. So is first of all, is there any truth in that statement? And second of all, like if there were those sorts of inclusions that, let's say, the Congress party was willing to make, because I think even sometimes that you've mentioned that when the Muslim League hadn't garnered as much votes. And many of the Muslims had actually voted for the INA, the Indian National Congress, the INC, rather, that and Nehru and people in the Congress party had said that if you want to be part of the national struggle, you can quit the Muslim League and join the National Congress to sort of have a bigger say on the constitution and those sorts of things. So, is there any truth in any of those statements? And if so, like why didn't he sort of choose the path of the Congress?
Well, first of all, I think there are several instances where Gandhi tried to convince Jinnah to work for a united India, for
Mm.
a democratic, inclusive India, like the 16th January letter saying
Mm.
that you are the only leader of such stature who can create an alternative party to the Indian National Congress
Yeah.
and become the democratic alternative to the Congress. Jinnah rejected it. Then I've gone through the correspondence between uh, Gandhi and Jinnah, Nehru and Jinnah, Subhash Chandra Bose and Jinnah, Rajendra Prasad and Jinnah. What we notice there is that after 1937, Jinnah rejected all proposals of the Indian National Congress to reach a compromise. He wanted the Congress to declare itself a Hindu party and accept Muslim League as the only party of the Muslims. I think the first thing was impossible. How could the
Mm.
Congress, in order to negotiate first declare itself to be a Hindu party? Second, how could it abandon those Muslims who had stood by the Congress all along, like the Khudai Khidmat Guards of the Northwest Frontier province, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and all? They remained loyal to the Congress till the very end, and they were opposed to the Muslim League. Then what about the Jamiat Ulama Hind, the biggest organization of northern Indian Muslims? The ulama who sided with the Indian National Congress. Then you have Abul Kalam Azad and so many other great or well-known Muslims, Sayyid Mahmood of Bihar and Asif Ali, and I'm just mentioning a few names.
Yeah.
How could such a party, in order to reach a deal with Jinnah, accept that it's a Hindu party and at the same time reject all other parties and accept the Muslim League as the only party of the Muslims? No, I think Jinnah had decided not to have any truck with the Congress at any point. But coming now to this proposal from Gandhi that we can make Jinnah the prime minister, and he can choose his own ministers, or even have uh, uh, ministers only from the Muslim League, and the Congress would support it. This was conveyed by Gandhi to the cabinet mission,
Mm.
and nobody has mentioned it. But Viceroy Wavell said, I can't make Jinnah the prime minister. All real authority will be exercised by the viceroy.
Yeah.
And so it was never conveyed to Jinnah. But even if they had done, Jinnah wouldn't be tempted by it.
Really.
No, it's impossible. I mean, it would show that the only thing he struggled was to become the prime minister of India
Yeah.
and lose his own, you know, respect and honor for whatever he did. I don't think that would have been successful. But this was never really conveyed to Jinnah.
Okay.
Wavell killed it, and not as in the Gandhi film that Nehru and Patel. Huh. I didn't find that evidence. I
Yeah.
found evidence of Wavell doing it. Why he
Okay.
did it, I don't know.
Mm. Yeah, that would have been an interesting thing to see unfold. Um, don't you think that even with the antagonism, let's say that Jinnah had with the National Congress and Gandhi in particular, that do you think there was a deep admiration he had within himself of Gandhi as like a mass leader of the national struggle, and something that maybe he would have wanted to emulate, but that wasn't the case? Because I this instance comes to mind, and I don't know how true it is, that when Gandhiji was assassinated, and Jinnah got the news in his residence in Pakistan, he told his secretary that I will not be taking any meetings for the rest of the day. And I would just want to be left alone, because he said that if Gandhi's died, then much of me has died as well. And this is to say that many of the rivals that we have, in terms of intellectual rivals, in terms of people who we disagree with, if in their demise, much of us is lost as well, because in some sense they've been the wall that sort of made us who we are, and made us stronghold our arguments. In what sense do you think that there was a deep admiration that Jinnah had of Gandhi, or do you think it's all just
No,
yeah,
I've never heard this story, and I don't think it has any basis in
any
fact.
grounding? Oh,
No.
okay.
What we know is, and it's given in the book on Jinnah, is that when the news that Gandhi was assassinated was conveyed to Jinnah, he immediately issued a statement that the great leader of the Hindu community,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
so so. And apparently, his secretary, who was an Englishman, said, can't we just say the great leader of Gandhi? He said, no, mention Hindu. Okay. So the first statement is Gandhi, the great leader of the leader of the great Hindu community, something like this.
Yeah, yeah.
That he had principles, and when he had principles, he stood for them. That's there, okay. But afterwards, in the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, the chief ministers of Punjab uh, Mumtaz Doltana, the Chief Minister of Bengal, Khwaja Nazmuddin, the Chief Minister of Sindh, uh, Ayub Khodu, and the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Liaquat Ali Khan, paid very generous tributes, homage to Gandhi, saying that this was his greatest hour. That now, when he was needed to prevent attacks on Muslims, he had given up his life doing that. So, in the final speech, he then says that Gandhi was a great leader. The Hindu word is excluded in the final. But
Yeah.
during the campaign for Pakistan, he kept on describing Gandhi as a fascist. Yes, yes, these are the words he uses. He was fixated by the fact that, or the feeling that Gandhi stole the leadership of the Indian people from him, that he was the natural born leader. And if that had remained true, then it was all right. But he could not be
Yeah.
second fiddle to Gandhi. That was also a problem of his ego, I think.
Mm.
So I don't think there is anything like uh, uh, him saying that a part of me is dead and all.
Yeah.
Where
You
have you
know,
heard
so much of this, as you said, like that becomes really difficult for me, and that's why I wanted to run it through you, because so much almost goes in the modern landscape of history reading that we do, that it becomes really difficult to sort of differentiate what was fact and what is just like fiction. Because I had
do you
heard,
have my Jinnah book? Do you have my Jinnah
I
book?
have ordered it, but in the UK there are very few copies. I
I know this is horrible.
yeah.
They are making it difficult for the book to get to the UK. I don't know.
Have you sort of spoken to any of the publishers? Because even for the
I
Punjab
have
book that I am
pleaded
reading,
with them. I have pleaded with them, but
yeah,
nobody pays any
because
heed.
even for the Punjab book on, I think I only found like a few copies on Amazon, and other places it's very difficult to sort of find it. So yeah, I mean, Dr. Ahmed, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Just one particular question before we leave. Can you
Okay.
give us some book recommendations? It could be anything. It could be on the subcontinent. It could be on political science. It could be books that have influenced you in the way you look at the world. So yeah, of course, people should read all your books as well. But any other
I
books?
was about to say, read my book to begin with. Uh, well, I have read Nehru's books. I think they are worth reading. Gandhiji, I've read. Then, right now, Nelson Mandela's, autobiography is worth reading. If you want to look at the role of great people, huh?
Mm,
But Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy fascinates me. That's one book I've always recommended people to read. Then,
did you know? Did you know Bertrand Russell has a cameo in a Bollywood film? Fun fact.
probably, I see, I didn't know that. Uh-huh.
There was this film back in the day called Amar, and he had Bertrand Russell has a cameo in that. So
Okay, I'll check it. Huh? And then Bhagat Singh's Why I Am an Atheist.
atheist, yeah.
That's worth reading. A man of only 23, 24, writing such a mature uh, uh, thesis,
Mm.
on his reasons for being an atheist is fascinating. Uh, right now, I'm too tired to think of
Yeah, yeah.
many. I mean, we have talked
um,
for more than 2 hours, I think.
yeah, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I kept you really long.
So I
I'd
enjoyed it too because doing this in English is quite rare. But
okay,
when you send me the
yeah,
video, then we'll share it. So
for
people
sure.
who don't understand Hindi or Urdu can also benefit.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I was wondering, because many of your interviews and talks have been in like Hinglish, I would say. English is like a word is used in India. कि
Yeah.
मतलब थोड़ा बहुत हिंदी, थोड़ा बहुत English.
Asal
But
mein
yeah,
all my education has been in English,
yeah,
but if I were to do videos only in English, very few people will follow me.
for sure. Yeah,
So
no, I
as an
understand.
academic, I'm not used to speaking either Urdu or any language when it is, academic stuff.
Huh.
But doing it, I must. And so a lot of English comes in. That's the reason.
No. Listen, Dr. Ahmed, like I'd love to have this conversation sometime again in the future.
Sure.
Thank you once again for coming on. And yeah, I'll end the recording.
All
Thank
the
you all
best.
for tuning in. Thank you so
Was it
much.
live? Were people watching
Yeah.
it?
Yes, yes, yes.
Are there some people who are watching? Can you check how many were there?
Currently it shows about like 50 people that were watching it.
Uh-huh.
So maybe people will tune in. But obviously, this is just the number of people who are watching it right now. When it gets uploaded, also people will watch it later on and those sorts
That's
of things.
correct. That's correct.
All
Okay.
right, all right. Thank you so much
My
for coming
pleasure.
in, everybody. So it's great.